Thank you, John. I'm Ann, and I am one of the new co-chairs, along with Barb Iverson, of the Racial Justice Initiative at Plymouth. And I also, along with Catherine Shreves, co-lead a group called Reimagining Community Safety. And John is part of that group. So we are happy he's helping to moderate this morning. We are thrilled to have Isaiah here this morning, and I know we're going to learn a lot about community organizing and specifically faith-based community organizing. I got to know Isaiah 20 years ago when I was Plymouth's liaison to MICA, the Metropolitan Interfaith Council on Affordable Housing, and we worked to get the Affordable Housing Trust Fund passed, and that's made a big difference in the city finally, and hopefully will continue to grow. So Doran Schrantz is here with us today, and she and I share a background of growing up in Southeast Iowa. Doran got her organizing experience in Chicago when she was in college, working in neighborhoods on community safety, community policing, and in neighborhoods like where the Robert Taylor homes used to be, for some of you who know Chicago a bit. And she said she really got influenced in this area during labor strikes in Southeast Iowa at some of the meat packing plants when she was growing up. And then Ben Whalen is also here, and many of you are familiar with Ben. He is the Minneapolis congregation organizer and has been with Isaiah for 6 months, but has a long history in the city. He was youth minister and director of youth and community organizing at several churches, UCC and Lutheran. He's on the city council at Richfield, so that really helps bring that governmental background. And he is the person many of us have worked with over the years. So welcome. And I'm not going to say a lot about Isaiah because I know you are. So
okay.
I'm just going to turn it over to you, Doran. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. And I'm so privileged and honored to be here with you this morning. I wish I could see you in person, but obviously we're doing our best here over Zoom. And I'm really excited to have this conversation today. As Ann said, my name is Doran Schrantz. I'm the executive director of Isaiah. I have been doing community organizing and community faith-based organizing for about 20 years. I did get my start in Chicago out of college, but moved to Minnesota 17 years ago. I sort of joked that I initially moved here to do a 6-month internship at Isaiah, and it's been 17 years. So I'm not originally from Minnesota, but I am genetically Minnesotan. My mom grew up in Albert Lea, and my dad grew up in Western Minnesota in a little town called Slayton. So I have been traveling back and forth between Iowa and Minnesota for a long time, between Chicago and Minnesota. My parents moved back here after my dad retired. And it has been a great honor and pleasure to be a part of political and public life in Minnesota for the past 17 years. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to do an introduction to Isaiah. I'm going to start with a little context, like what is the context we're operating in right now? So any work that we do, any work that you do, anything we're thinking about happens in a context and in a moment and in a place and in a time. And then introduce you to kind of like, what is Isaiah? What is our mission? Like, and then most importantly, how do we think about, what is the practices? What's the methodology? How do we think about doing the work? And then close with some about just kind of our structure and the agenda as a sort of public agenda that we work on together across the organization. And then I'm going to turn it over to Ben, who's going to share with you a little bit what's happening practically in the next upcoming year in Minneapolis. So if that sounds good, I will wade in. So I want to start with a conversation about Minnesota, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Slideshow, sorry. So I like to share these two pictures when I think about, I'm just going to keep it here. For some reason, it's not opening into this slideshow. So you can look at this picture. I like to share this picture when I think about Minnesota, because when I first started coming to Minnesota to visit my family here, one of the things that I most enjoyed about our road trips is that as we would cross the border into Minnesota, we would get access to public radio. So there was no public radio in Iowa, and we would cross the border into Minnesota, and oftentimes Prairie Home Companion was on the public radio. And I love to listen to the stories about Lake Wobegon and love to listen to Garrison Keillor tell those stories. And I don't know if I was a weird kid, but I really loved it. It sort of brought Minnesota alive. They were incredible stories about real people and like like the fabric of people's lives, and they were funny. But when I look at this iconic Time magazine cover of Wendell Anderson and think about Lake Wobegon, what it makes me think about is sort of like how white Minnesotans conceive of themselves. So what do we see about, what Minnesota is about, who it is, who we've been? It's not something to not be proud of. It is it's a history and a tradition, people's Norwegian and Swedish backgrounds, We have like a strong set of traditions in Minnesota, a strong civic tradition, but it looks kind of like the 1970s Time magazine cover, kind of in our mind's eye. And the most recent iconic Time magazine cover is Ilhan Omar. And I think the contrast between these two pictures is sort of a way in to beginning to understand what is unfolding in Minnesota and how are people relating to that change. And what does that change mean about how we conceive of ourselves and of like who we are as Minnesotans, who we are as people who live in the Twin Cities, what we imagine our future is going to be, and whether we're excited about that future, whether that future is something like rich and exciting and new and unfolding, or whether that future might also feel scary. Or do people feel a sense of loss? And Minnesota, even 20 years ago, I think was more like 5% people of color. And we are now, as we go into 2021, approaching close to 20% people of color in our state. So we're not California, but that is a very significant and very rapid change. And one way that I think about what we do in Isaiah, I think about it in the context actually of the United States. And, we could do like a whole seminar for weeks on the history of the United States as it relates to the question of race and identity and politics. But a short version is that we have been struggling as a country to understand what it means to be a multiracial democracy for the whole time. And I would argue that what we're experiencing very viscerally in Minnesota, amongst many other things, is the question of, is it possible for Minnesota to be a multiracial democracy that is inclusive, that is fair, that is just, and not just in a sense of like, oh, we have to make things fair, a sense of seriousness about that, but can we construct a sense of identity that celebrates where we've been and celebrates where we're going at the same time? And that does mean we're going to have to think about racial justice, like what will make it just, because justice in our laws, in our access to education, access to all those things is critical to being a multiracial democracy. But I also think we have to invite, and I think people of faith have an enormous role to play in this, to invite a sense of imagination and excitement about who we're becoming. It's exciting. We have an extraordinary future in front of us. And I think we have a role to play as people of faith in exciting people's imagination about compassion and humanity and who Minnesota can be. So when I wanted to say that because when I think about Isaiah's work, I see it sitting inside that context of this change, this incredible change process that is unfolding in Minnesota, and the incredible role I actually believe that Minnesota can play in the arc of the United States becoming a multiracial democracy. And I totally believe that we can do it. So I wanted to start there. So Isaiah, just to tell you what it is, we are a 501c3 organization, and we organize faith and community grounded institutions across race and place to build a just, inclusive, and multiracial democracy in Minnesota. So we have probably, somewhere between 300 to 500 partner community institutions. Some of those institutions are full-on governing members. That means that they are formal members of the organization. And then we have a whole host of partner institutions, meaning they are engaging with the work that we're doing. They have people who are plugging in. They may not be members at this point, but they are also using the vehicle of Isaiah and its capacity for collective agency to do work in the world. So just to give you a picture of the scope and scale of those kinds of community institutions, we have about 100 member Christian and Unitarian congregations. We have 34 Islamic centers that make up the Muslim coalition of Isaiah. We have 512 community-based childcare centers that are part of something called the Kids Count on Us campaign that is looking towards universal access to childcare. And then we have an emerging set of community-based institutions that I would call, we definitely are barbershops. We have a barbershop and beauty shop project that is run by Brian Fullman. And they are barbershops and beauty shops in North Minneapolis, Brooklyn Park, Golden Valley, and are basically barbershops or community spaces. So it's a place where we're doing like voter registration, political education, conversations, leadership development. And then increasingly through our work with the Muslim community, there are a host of small businesses from the Muslim community that are also starting to relate to the organization. It is also Twin Cities and suburban, but we have essentially chapters all across central Minnesota and southern Minnesota. So in particular, St. Cloud, Rochester, Northfield, Mankato, Wilmer, kind of that area. And that has really grown in the last 5 or 6 years. So when I say race and place, I also mean rural and urban, greater Minnesota and the kind of anchor metropolitan area. So that's kind of the what, that is the mission and the what and the who of Isaiah. But I want to spend most of my time talking a little bit about how we do the work. Because if the purpose is to build democracy and to strengthen democracy for justice and fairness, racial and economic justice in Minnesota, then democracy is about people, and democracy is about people themselves having a path to agency and power in relationship to public decisions that get made. So we actually expend the majority of our shared resources investing in people. So the community-based institution is a member, but the membership means we are creating a space in which people who are a part of that institution are getting on a path themselves to what it means to be a public person, to engage in democracy. That means both being on a path yourself about like what does it mean for me to lead? It's one thing to say these words, but I don't know if any of you have had this experience where you get invited into like, I'm going to go to a meeting with an elected official, or I'm going to chair a meeting. I've never chaired a meeting before. We all go through, no matter actually where we're situated in society, whether we're very educated or not educated, or had a lot of experiences in public or not, we actually have to wrestle with questions about what it means for us to lead. And that's actually part of learning. That's part of learning. So we spend a lot of time on training, learning, building relationships, getting people into a sense of connection and collective agency with one another. And that really is the focus. If you don't focus on that, what you end up with, which is also a totally legitimate way to engage in the world, but it's not the way we engage in the world, is kind of like high level advocacy. So our goal, which is mean people speaking for other people, our goal is that people are collective agents in speaking for themselves around the things that matter to them. And that is a hugely important piece of our theory of change, that it's actually differentials in power that cause a lot of what we see around us. And part of how we shift power is that people with collective agency act together in the world. So that is central to how we do our work. The second point I want to make is that we focus on a multiracial solidarity framework. So what I mean by that is that everybody has a stake, whether you're white or Black or immigrant, or rural or from a small town or from Minneapolis, whether you live in Linden Hills or you live in North Minneapolis, we actually all have a stake in building a multiracial democracy. Hey, just one minute. Sorry. That was a result of some doing things from home here. So, and then lastly, what I would say is that we do grassroots leadership development, engage with people across very significant differences of race, place, ethnicity to build a shared public agenda, and then operate together in the world around public and collective strategic action. So what I want to talk a little bit about collective and strategic action. Here's a couple of concrete examples of what I mean by that. So public action is about demonstrating and clarifying a choice kind of basically in public, demonstrating solidarity, our public commitment, a collective show of unified support. And that can happen in a lot of different contexts. So these are some pictures here of public actions that members of Isaiah and through our community institutions have taken. So you see there in public, we also partner with people of other faiths. Many of you probably know Rabbi Latz. That's Rabbi Latz with his daughter at an event that we did around school suspensions in Minneapolis. So it brought people across faiths together. We were doing a petition with the Minneapolis School Board to have a conversation about doing a moratorium on suspensions for kids who are under 5th grade. Another picture there is of the Latino caucus of Isaiah. They're getting ready to go do a public action with a federal congressperson. But the reason I wanted to show the behind the scenes is because that is where we actually fortify. It's with each other, our collective sense of agency and possibility, prepare people for their roles, like go out into the world to have the conversation that we need to have. And then lastly here, this was a Souls to the Polls Day, where clergy demonstrated their support for people voting and sort of declaring people's right to vote and voting. And we did an event at City Hall. So those are just some examples of public places where then after we prepare ourselves, we build a public agenda and we go out into the world. We do that at multiple levels. So that can happen in a city, it can happen in a neighborhood, it can happen in a county, it can happen at the state level. This is actually a picture of some of the St. Paul leaders of Isaiah, so St. Paul congregations who were engaged a couple of years ago in passing paid sick days policy in partnership with the city council and the mayor of St. Paul. This was a press conference with partners, and Diane Brennan, you see there at the microphone, she actually runs a beauty shop in St. Paul, and she went to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, St. Paul Reformation, and has been a leader with Isaiah for a long time. And there she is talking both as a faith leader, but also as a small business owner about paid sick days. We work a lot at the Capitol. This is a picture of a giant press conference we did to launch our Freedom to Drive campaign, which is about driver's licenses for immigrants. Isaiah plays a significant role at the state capitol, but not just grassroots lobbying, but we have a long-term agenda. We have long relationships with public officials, and probably the most important role that an organization like Isaiah plays is, for example, in this upcoming legislative session, I think we'll probably have 45 to 50 different in-district engagements with policymakers, probably with 2,000 to 3,000 people. That it's really those people in relationship with their policymakers over time that make a significant difference in terms of how people think about what the public agenda should be. And that is an enormous contribution that an organization like Isaiah plays in a policymaking process. And then lastly, especially since 2012, we have also engaged in depth in like voter and civic engagement. So in 2012 was our first time doing this. We built a scaled program to wade into, we were against voter ID, the voter ID constitutional amendment. That was the amendment that all of our members agreed on. And so we worked on that, and we, kind of without knowing what we were doing exactly, built a very effective faith person to faith person persuasion conversation, and had about 37,000 long form conversations with people of faith in Minnesota about voter ID. And as probably most of you know, voter ID was defeated in 2012, and Isaiah played a significant role because of those person-to-person conversations. Since then, we do a lot of just voter education. We tend to focus on people who are more infrequent voters. So an example would be our Muslim Coalition has built a very significant community-based program to just invite people to vote. And we just got sort of some evidence back. And in the precincts that they worked in, there is a 20% jump in voting rates in precincts that are predominantly Muslim and Somali, where they were working. So that, is somewhat about issues, but a lot of it is just about communities talking to each other about the importance of democracy and civic engagement, and why it's important for our power and for our voice to have a voice in our elections. So those are some examples of places we're collectively engaging in the public arena to shape policy, to shape public discourse, to shape the narrative, and to shape the electorate, to sort of say, and all of those things go back to who has a voice. Is multiracial democracy working? Do we have a sense of solidarity? And is there a common path forward for us? So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about our structure, which is kind of confusing to some people when they first start engaging with the organization, because it's a solidarity model and it's a agency model, meaning people themselves need a path to agency and voice. We don't have like a small group of people that decide everything. That's not how the organization works. We have to do a lot of internal alignment across what I would call bases and constituencies. So it's not like there's like a back room someplace where a set of staff and a few people decide things. In fact, we have to go through a lot of process as an organization to both respect trajectories that parts of the organization are on. It's not like people in Northfield get to tell people in the leaders of Northfield don't get to tell the leaders of Minneapolis exactly what issues they're going to work on. That wouldn't work. And it's also true that the Christian congregations have to respect the trajectory and path of the Muslim Coalition. The Muslim Coalition has to respect the path and trajectory of Kids Count on Us or the barbershops. So this isn't the greatest picture, but we sort of think about Isaiah as a house that shares electricity, shares sort of infrastructure. And we have a common room. You see this room that says Commons, but actually different bases and constituencies. And I would say it's two ways. Some of it is, and this is the growth over the past 4 years of the different rooms in the house. The Barbershop Cooperative, the Muslim Coalition, the Sanctuary Network, this One Body thing is it's a Catholic specific organizing program. Kids Count on Us is the childcare centers. We have a clergy space and a Latinx base that also is kind of overlays with the One Body Catholic space. So we share things in common. We work through things, and we have an amazing amount of solidarity across all these different bases because people are really grounded in this sense of multiracial democracy, that we're about agency and we're about people participating. And sometimes we have to work through things, but a lot of times because of that respect and solidarity model, there's often not a lot, there's very rarely, if ever, sort of conflict across them because people have their own room to move based on their own interests. But also we have a shared set of values, mission, and commitments, and a way that we think about the work. So I'm going to close there and turn it over to Ben. That was the big picture. And he's going to talk about what's coming up concretely next.
Awesome. Thanks, Doran. I'm Ben Whalen. I'm the Minneapolis Congregations organizer, and where I wanted to start actually ties in nicely to what Doran was just talking about, that because we organize differently, and we're not just like an advocacy group, a lot of people, again, on structure that can be a little confusing at first. We don't have like a group that's working on healthcare and a group that's working on climate in the way that some other organizations have. That for you guys at Plymouth, if you join, like if the whole congregation joins, if you as an individual want to plug in, you'd be working with me as the and our Minneapolis congregations base. And so that is about 20 congregations in Minneapolis who have, some of them are members, some are not, but who have people who plug into the work that we're doing. And then we relate to a whole bunch of different initiatives, efforts, issues. And so I want to name two as kind of the primary paths that we're going down in the coming months, just to give you a sense of what kinds of things we work on. So the first is how we in Minneapolis congregations relate to what's happening at the state level. And so Doran mentioned some in-district meetings with legislators. We're going to have actually next weekend is a training. People will be gearing up to host in districts with our legislators from District 61, 62, and 63. And the primary things that are moving right now at the state level are raising revenue by taxing the wealthy in order to fund the programs we need, which there's several, but a primary one being childcare. That has a pretty big price tag, but also like huge stakes if we don't do that. Continuing to expand democracy by restoring the right to vote, automatic voter registration, a few other democracy pieces, paid family and medical leave, and then continued work around the climate and moving toward 100% clean energy. So those are some of the priorities that are we're focused most on in those in districts. That is not an exhaustive list of everything we want the state to do by any means. So that is moving ahead and will culminate, we expect, in the budget negotiations in mid-May that may come in or continue into special sessions given how past times have gone. But so there'll be opportunities to plug in and relate around that. And then at the local level this year, you may know that there are potential charter amendments moving in Minneapolis. One around potentially multiple around transforming public safety, and then a couple that relate to creating a process for rent stabilization for more stable and affordable housing. And so we are certainly planning to work on those and encouraging our people who care about those and want to move those forward to be part of the caucus and convention process that's happening this year, and using that as a place to shape the public expectation and mandate for these kinds of changes. So I'll stop there. There's obviously a lot more I could say, but want to provide, and I'll share in the chat my contact info for anyone who wants to get involved with our work, have further questions, want to see like what the specific dates are for things. I would be your point of contact. And so I just shared my email and my cell number in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me. But with that, I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. And so we'll pass it back to our facilitators.
Okay, great. So just a reminder to everybody, if you want to ask a question out loud, please click on the raise your hand button, and Ann and I will be monitoring that list of participants, or list of attendees rather, and look for you there and let you ask your question out loud. Or if you'd prefer, type in a question in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those in just a minute. Ann, do you have a question you'd like to start out with? If not, I do.
I do, and then I'll pass it to John. You know, I've been reading, I haven't read the book yet, but I've been reading interviews and hearing them with Heather McGhee. And she worked for Demos for years and has a Black woman who's got a tremendous economic justice viewpoint. And she talks about, why can't we have nice things? And she said, and I don't mean a boat on a lake. I mean healthcare for all, childcare, adequate education, you know, those things that we all believe everyone deserves. And I would just love for you to reflect on both the race class issue and how that intersects, and what you see in Minnesota that is preventing us from having those really important things.
I am so glad you brought up Heather McGhee. Everyone should read her book. I actually haven't read it yet, but I've heard, I actually know Heather McGhee, and I've heard her speak at like multiple events. So I think what's so important about what she's saying, it kind of goes to this question of multiracial democracy. So there's so many paradigms that divide us by race and class. Sometimes even we have good intentions around it, race, class, place, where I think what she's trying to imagine is both the policy framework and the kind of mental imagination, kind of the political framework that would sort of lay the foundation and be the compass for how do we navigate towards really being a just and inclusive and multiracial democratic country. And she instigated, Isaiah actually partnered with Demos on a project called the Race Class Narrative Project that Heather hosted at Demos. And I was so excited when I read their proposal for that, because really what it was how do we research, like with evidence-based research, public opinion that would allow white folks and working class white folks and people of color, immigrants of color, African Americans, actually be energized in a sense of identity towards a multiracial democratic vision. And some of you may have seen this around, but in 2018, Isaiah helped to host something called the Greater Than Fear campaign.
Yes.
That came out of that research. So Heather and her team actually did in 2017 in partnership with Isaiah and some other organizations, Take Action Minnesota, SEIU, Satul, like a set of organizations saying, help us with this. Like, how do we create a conversation that sort of navigates through like what we think is really going on in Minnesota and create the public discourse that's rooted in multiracial democratic values? And how do we get our public officials to use that message too? You know, that was like part of the whole picture. How do we get, because given the context where we're in, our belief was that's the most important scaled public conversation we could be having in Minnesota to move us forward. And so that Greater Than Fear campaign in 2018 ended up with countless organizations a part of it, and her team, it's actually Anat Shanker-Osario actually did the research part, like the hard research, and then helped us with that creative campaign. That's kind of, I sort of think of those things as like bridges. So I think what prevents us in Minnesota from having nice things is the same thing that's preventing us in the country from having nice things. Anytime we're talking about the role of government, there's two questions that emerge, I think, for a lot of people. One is the government mine? Like, am I a stakeholder in it? Or is it a third party out there that I'm alienated from? And the second question is, who is the government service for? Who's going to get it? And I think those two questions that happen inside of people have everything to do with like definitely 75 to 100 years about associating the government with giving things to people who are not me, in particular people of color. So it's a scarcity zero-sum conversation. And until we break through that zero-sum conversation, it's very hard to have a just rational conversation as a state about not only what would universal childcare look like, but do we think the government should pick up all of our trash, which was the fight that we had in St. Paul last year. I mean, it's the same. It's actually the fight about universal childcare, universal healthcare is almost like the same conversation we had in St. Paul, which seems absurd. Should St. Paul, and obviously there's other things, should we have collective trash collection? You know? So I really think that we as people of faith have a huge role to play in saying, we're going to shift the conversation to one of abundance and one of solidarity and agency. We're all agents in relationship to democracy and government. We all have a stake in it. We're actually owners of it. We're not alienated from it. And I think if we can have breakthroughs around those two things, we'll make more progress.
Thank you. John, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, well, we're starting to get some questions from participants, so I'm going to go to one of those instead. And again, please feel free to submit your questions or raise your hand. But we have a question here from John Sartorius. Can you explain how the related organization called Faith in Minnesota fits into Isaiah? Your house with the rooms somewhat.
Yeah, there was like a little side thing that said Faith in Minnesota. Yeah.
Yeah, go into a little more detail on how that works.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So Faith in Minnesota is a separate organization, but it is a related organization. So it is separate. It has its own board. It has its own it's a legally separate organization. And so individuals are part of Faith in Minnesota, not institutions. And it is a vehicle for people of faith and community-based grounded people to have a voice directly in political decisions. So that looks like two things. One thing it looks like is sometimes direct engagement around a candidate, like this candidate is supported or not supported. Most of the work, though, actually is more overt, being able to just have a more overt and free conversation about issues in election seasons. So, for example, in an election season, Isaiah actually has a C3, the closer you get to a political season, the less you can publicly say that might be perceived as partisan. So, for example, a C3 would have a very difficult time having a conversation about climate starting about 6 months before an election. Because like it or not, climate is perceived, like a reasonable person could perceive it as a polarized partisan issue. It's unfortunate that that's where we are, but that is true. So through Faith in Minnesota, we can talk about climate all the way through. Or you can do things like scorecards or, you just have a lot more freedom in the context of the election. So for example, that Greater Than Fear campaign I just talked about, there was a C3 component to that campaign. But as we got closer to the election, really Faith in Minnesota had to carry that because it was even though we were having a values conversation about, a multiracial democracy, it was in the context of an election, so it was safer for Faith in Minnesota to do that. So they are legally separate, but it is a related organization to do different things.
Okay, let's go to a next question. Rebecca Miller would like to hear a little bit briefly how Isaiah got started.
Yes, it goes way, way back. way back in the day. So actually the way where Isaiah's origin story is that I think it was like in the early 90s, the Archdiocese of the Twin Cities began to explore doing faith-based organizing. It was connected to the Office for Social Justice in the Archdiocese. So what happened is there was a set of staff who said, we want to do this, but we ultimately want it to be ecumenical. And at that time, getting Lutherans and Catholics to work together was like a big deal. So they started the organizing in the archdiocese, and then the archdiocese hosted the staff. But then the staff built organizations that were ecumenical and local. So it started as the St. Paul Ecumenical Alliance, Interfaith Action in Minneapolis, an organization called GRIP in St. Cloud, the Great River Interfaith Partnership. And those predecessor organizations sort of then spun off on their own, kind of coming out of the archdiocese. And then in the year 2000, they went through, those three organizations went through a pretty extensive process to decide to merge, to become one organization called Isaiah. So Isaiah really only started in 2000, but it came from that history of those ecumenical faith-based community organizations that got started out of the archdiocese and then merged.
All right, great, thank you. A question, let's say you have a member who is interested in, let's say, women's health issues, and you have another member who is, for whatever reason, and I don't know that these people would be attracted to Isaiah necessarily, but someone who is strongly anti-abortion. How do, do those conversations take place in the organization and or not? Or, how do you decide which issues you can move ahead with?
So historically, it is still true to this day, there are two significant dividing lines in the organization. It's actually not in Isaiah. The dividing lines are out in the world that make it, kind of like in a faith constituency, make it very difficult for there to be any public and collective work on. One of them that's still true, and one of them becoming less so. So the issue of abortion in particular is something that the Catholic teaching right now is very clear on. The historic African-American mainline congregations have a position on, and the Muslims have a position on. And then the mainline Protestant congregations do as well. So it is an issue. Abortion in particular is an issue that the organization simply does not work. We remain neutral on the question of abortion. What has changed is there is more overt, and I think it's been really powerful actually, like more overt conversations about gender and the way gender plays out in people's lives, and gender as a justice issue, both in terms of women, but also LGBTQ rights and what that means in the lives of our faith communities, but also what it means in the world. And so I think that sometimes what's really powerful about the role that Isaiah can play on issues like that, it's frustrating to people both pro and against that we might be neutral, like as publicly on some of those pieces, but internally, we actually are a space where people can have pretty hard conversations about those issues. I would say we had a pretty extensive process in 2012 around the marriage amendment, which I know you guys probably did too at Plymouth. So, and it was, we really created spaces where people who were in very different places could talk to each other. And I think that, I actually think over the last 6 or 7 years, there's been a shift, partially because of 2012 and the incredible work that has happened in the world around the question around gender and advocacy on those things. I think there's like a really powerful space for people to have that conversation. But it is difficult, given who we are and the nature of our constituency, to have public positions like at the state legislature on those issues.
Okay, I apologize. We are nearing the end of our time, and I think the questions that we have left are the nature of which there's no way we're going to be able to get a question and answer in the amount of time that we've got left. So
we can do follow-up. So
yes, please.
Yeah.
If you did not get your question answered, please feel free to follow up with Doran and Ben afterwards. And again, sorry, we just don't have time to get to everything. So two pieces of business to take care of at this point. One is a loud and appreciative round of applause for Doran and Ben for a terrific presentation. So glad that Isaiah is in our midst and doing the work that you are doing. So if we can, I don't know, whatever, in whatever way you can convey to Doran and Ben that we appreciate their
Receive it.
yes. Okay, great.
Yeah.
I think they're getting it.